So Honorable Tessa Ugbo joins us. He is the chairman Ad-Hoc Committee on Students' Loan and Access to Higher Education. He's also deputy committee chair on environment. Good morning. Thank you for coming on today.
Yeah, good morning.
Well, listen to that. I mean, one needs to ask: is there an issue? Is there a challenge with this loan, this act now?
Well, yeah, there are improvements that needs to be made to the act that was signed into law by the president when he assumed office. And as soon as he signed that law, there was public outcry from stakeholders in the sector regarding a lot of the requirements and the bottlenecks that were obviously observable in the act. So as the National Assembly, we took the responsibility to provide leadership to amending the act and providing some framework on how the student loans program should work in Nigeria. And that is what we've been trying to do over the last few weeks since the Ad-Hoc committee was set up.
I see some places where you say that schools should not increase school fees, but some of them argue, well, Unity school fees has been increased from 45 to 100,000, so that's in principle. They wonder, what's wrong if it applies in tertiary institutions?
Well, it seems obvious that school fees will probably go up in tertiary institutions in Nigeria. Tertiary education has been subsidized for so many years in Nigeria. Just the way we've subsidized petroleum, we subsidized power, we subsidized, just almost everything we've subsidized since the 70s. And so universities have been run by allocations from the federal government. Yeah. But it's about time that universities start finding some autonomy so they can operate independently, they can source for other sources of funding. And then, of course, as a business, the students are the customers to the schools. And so the students, too, the school fees they pay, as proposed by the federal government through the student loan scheme, is also a funding mechanism for universities to make sure that the quality of education they're providing for the student is matching with the cost of that education, which is what the student loan scheme was trying to balance out.
I'm quite excited about the fact that the House of Reps is, taking a very strong look, excuse me, at the implementation of the student loan. I think tomorrow you're holding is it a conference on it?
Legislative summit, yeah.
What's that?
A summit, a legislative summit.
Legislative summit, and what do you hope to achieve with that?
Well, the whole idea is to bring together stakeholders in the sector and policymakers to share ideas and propose amendments to the current Student Loans Act. For example, when the president, in the last national broadcast by the president, he announced that he was waiving all requirements or hindrances to accessing the student loans by students. So it means that every student who wants to get a student loan for education should be allowed to apply and access student loans. But to implement that, you have to amend the Act, because the Act puts a lot of restrictions on who can access, how you can access these loans, the requirements, guarantors from lawyers and things like that. So all those encumbrances, all the requirements, we need to waive them aside and find other mechanisms through which we can make it easier for students to access these loans, and of course make it easy for them to pay back these loans after graduation.
Well, the requirements were such that a lot of students were, up in arms and saying that, look, with the kind of criteria that has been listed here, it means that nobody will be able to access the loans. First and foremost, even talk about minimum wage. And even those on a minimum wage, who maybe both parents are on a minimum wage cycle, will automatically not qualify for the loan, because at the end of the day, I mean, if you look at their salaries per annum, they fall out of the people, whose children will qualify for this. So what are some of the parameters that you're looking at now? And will it also cover students in private universities, or is it just strictly for students who are looking to government-owned universities?
Well, the Act as it is only focused on targeted to public universities. Universities, polytechnics, colleges of education, as long as it's a higher institution. We anticipate that the private universities will have something to say about this. It happened with the TED Fund. When the TED Fund was established, it was focused on public institutions, but eventually they opened to private institutions. And we think that for this student loan scheme, private institutions should be probably allowed to participate. The feeling is that if you can afford private education for your child, then you don't need a student loan. But that is not really the reality, because a lot of parents have been forced to move their kids to private universities because of the inefficiency in the public school strikes and all that. A lot of parents have taken out loans of their own to fund their children in private universities, just to avoid the strikes and the uncertainty that has bedeviled our public education system over the years. So it is not a given that because a child is in a private school, then that means the parents can afford to pay for private education. You mentioned the issue of the minimum wage for parents. The limit was 500,000 naira. So if your family combined income is above 500,000 naira, that means you cannot participate. Which means if your father is a security man somewhere, he earns 50,000 naira per month. I mean, he's earning something like 600,000 monthly. So his kids can't participate. So if he has 4 kids in university, because he earns 50,000 naira a month, then his children can't participate in student loans, which is obviously very unrealistic. So these are some of the things that we're looking at, and we hope to eliminate some of those kind of bottlenecks that are just not realistic for.
For a number of people, is to keep the loan revolving. This is not the first time that the federal government has come up with laudable schemes to try and see how people can get loans. But the payback is always an issue. And how optimistic are you that given this culture we've experienced over time, well, I don't say culture, maybe I should say our experience over time with all things loans, even banks, deposit money banks usually have quite a bit of challenge getting their money back. And we were saying how the AMCON has had to come and write off loans for a number of banks. How optimistic are you that this is something that we can make differently this time around and, have it a truly revolving, student loan door?
Well, from our studies, of student loan schemes across the world, there's no student loan scheme that can actually survive purely based on a revolving fund. It always is an intervention kind of thing. So the government will always have to budget some money for students' loans in the country because you will always expect defaults. The most important thing is to reduce the default rates as much as possible, to put in place mechanisms that guarantee that students are able to pay these loans after school and are able to find jobs to pay the loans. So we don't anticipate that in the next 6 to 10 years, when maybe the first batch of student loans repayments will start, Nigeria will still be in a situation where the average student graduates and cannot find a job. We're hoping that things will improve and more jobs will be created for students upon graduation. But most importantly, it is the duration of how we're trying to structure this loan. So, for example, if you took a loan of 1 million naira to fund your education for 4 years, and after 4 years, you're given 1 year for NYSC and another year to stabilize and find a job. So after 6 or 7 years, then you start paying the loan, and you have 10 to 20 years to pay this loan. So it comes down to something like 10,000 to 20,000 naira monthly for repayment over a very long stretch of time. And we anticipate that 10,000 monthly, 20,000 naira monthly as repayment shouldn't be too much for an average student to pay once you come out of school and you find something doing. Nigeria currently has the database systems, the BVN, the NIN, and all that can track revenue and income of every citizen in the country through the bank accounts. So I'm sure government will be able to put a tab on defaulters, not to criminalize default, because we know the challenges in finding jobs and how it could be difficult in several circumstances. But it's just to make it as easy as possible to encourage citizens to pay up. And of course, there'll be checks and balances over time. If you don't pay your student loans, then you have a credit, a debt in your credit rating.
Okay, Honorable, if you can hear me, Honorable, it's interesting that you, if you put it that way, Honorable, can you hear me? Yeah, so, I mean, it's interesting that you put it that way. I mean, I take a phrase from what you just said now, your response to Malquest's question, find jobs. And my question goes straight to the quality of education for which you are loaning people, students, money. Does the job of your committee remotely or directly touch on the quality of education for which you have, quality of education that you are funding? Because it is one thing for them to get these loans and go to school. It's another thing entirely for that loan to be able to give them the kind of education that will make them employable. A former Minister of Labor, I think, at some point said that we have unemployable graduates in Nigeria. I don't know if the quality of education, the curriculum, have changed since that time. So is your job in any way, remotely or directly, anything to do with the quality of education, the curriculum that the students have to study with?
I think the student loan program it creates a win-win situation for both the students, the institutions of higher learning across the country, and the country in general. And why do I say this? I expect that if students begin to pay school fees representative of the quality of education that they are expected to receive upon paying this kind of school fees, then the institutions have a responsibility to employ better teachers, improve their quality of teaching, improve the skills of their teachers themselves, and of course generally improve the learning environment across public institutions in Nigeria. It is something that we expect as part of the ripple effect that will happen as a result of this student loan scheme. It's also a way of funding universities. It's like an indirect way of funding universities. So instead of just allocating funds to universities every month, every year, as we currently have, this time around you're offering these funds to universities through student loans. So the schools have a responsibility to the students to make sure that they provide better quality education for the students in Nigeria. And we as a committee, it's an ad-hoc committee, to come up with a framework on how best these student loan schemes can be implemented.
I'm glad you also mentioned,
we know that once we finish our job and we hand over to the committee itself, then they will take over in ensuring that the implementation and the quality of education that is provided is also improved through this funding that will be provided.
I'm glad you also talked about the schools themselves, the institutions of higher learning in all of this conversation. Is there a monitoring system to ensure that the schools deliver as much as the students are paying for? Because now it is the students that are going to be paying for their education by themselves, going by what we're saying about the student loan thing. So is there a way to also ensure that the students get value for their money from the school system, i.e. infrastructure, as you mentioned, learning facilities, and a staving off of strikes?
Yeah, one of the challenges we've had over the years in Nigeria, is the issue of strike. And why have strikes happened? Obviously, as a result of poor funding of education, and this has led to a drop in the quality of education we've had in the country for many, many years. We've not invested enough in education. We've not met the targets set up by the United Nations and other international experts on the quantity of funding that should go into education as a ratio of our national budget. Nigeria actually ranks as one of the lowest in Africa in funding tertiary education as a percentage or a ratio of our GDP and budget. So we need to improve and increase this figure. It is one of the reasons why we as a committee proposed maybe an increase to the 1% that is proposed in the Act. The Act currently proposes that 1% of all national revenue from the FRS, from customs, immigrations, the oil sector is put aside for student loans funds. But we realize that this might not be constitutionally very possible because of the issues with the states and sharing of the revenue that comes in. And so, if the federal government is going to fund this scheme through its own share of the federal allocation, then obviously an increase in this 1% will have to be effected to make sure that there's enough funding for the student loan schemes, and also, of course, invariably more funding for universities to improve their facilities and infrastructure. The Federal Ministry of Education has said a lot in terms of the efforts they've made to improve public education in Nigeria. We all know the decay in public education, not just at the tertiary institution level, from basic education all the way up to tertiary education. But through this scheme and through the funding that is being proposed for financing this scheme and, of course, indirectly financing the universities, we expect that universities will take the mantle now to improve the quality of the education, improve the salaries of lecturers in this country, and ultimately improve the quality of education, the curriculums, so that our students are graduating from school better educated. Yeah.
Indeed, Honorable Teze, the student loan would be an indirect way of funding the universities, but it's also, that's just part of the funding aspect required by universities, considering the overall overhead that universities require to function. But earlier on, you were talking about mechanisms that will be put in place to ensure that, students are not criminalized post the repayment plan. This is important, Honorable Teze, because of the, high level of unemployment in the country, and I believe that the Act sorts of provided a minimal prison term for those who are unable to pay back. What mechanisms will be put in place to ensure that, you know, repayment plan will be fail-safe, will enable the loan applicants' payback?
Well, like I said earlier, no student loan scheme in the world is 100% foolproof in terms of recovery of student loans, because we know that, number one, there will be debts of students, there will be dropouts, there will be abscondments, there will be a lot of tricks that many students who can even afford to pay, but we decide not to pay, as we've had in the past with other loan schemes in the country. We have this perception that government funding is free money, so we don't have a duty to repay this kind of funds. But I think because we now have systems in place like the BVN, we have systems in place that we could put as checks and balances. For example, if you're owing a student, if you got funding to go to school and you graduated 20 years ago, you've been working and you have not paid your student loans, you may want to contest an election one day. You may want to get a federal appointment one day. You may want to even travel abroad one day. And when it is found out that you have student loans that you've not paid for several years, and it's obvious that you've earned a lot of income over the last 10 to 20 years after graduation, then maybe there could be some penalties for that kind of default. But the idea of the student loan scheme is not to criminalize non-payment of loans, because we know the challenges that have to do with employment in Nigeria and poverty and other aspects of our national development. So the most important thing is to create a system that makes it easy for students to repay these loans over a long period of time, put in place insurance programs in place, put in place even grants and waivers that could also come in to sometimes support or clear up some of these grants. The average Nigerian graduate, average Nigerian student will be looking for either a government job or white-collar job. We're also insisting that every private organization or government agency that is employing a graduate, one of the criteria to check is to check if the student if the student owes student loans. And if you do, then it is put as part of your deductions on your income as soon as you're getting this job. So the amount of students who go into government jobs and who get white-collar jobs in organized private sector, it will be much easier to track their incomes and make sure that these loans are repaid. But for those students who will end up in the informal sector, who will end up in private businesses, probably this is where we're going to have to be looking at, tracking their incomes over time and encouraging them and putting in place mechanisms that makes it easy for them to pay these loans, just to reduce the default as much as possible.
But does that mean that
like I said earlier too,
does that mean, sorry, Honorable Teze, does that mean that the 2-year repayment plan required will be reviewed just to take into cognizance those that may not immediately get a government job or even a private sector job?
Well, the idea is to give as much time as possible for repayment. So if you're studying a 4-year course, after 4 years, you have 1 year for NYC and 1 extra year to settle down and look for a job. So that makes it 6 years. If you're studying a 5-year course, then you have 1 year extra for NYC and 1 year for free to look for a job and so forth. And so we expect that the repayment plan starts after you finish this moratorium period of schooling, NYC, and the extra year, and then you have maybe 10 years to 20 years to repay these loans. And from our analysis, in every scenario that we've tried to recreate the possibilities and the payment plan for students, we don't anticipate that any student will be made to pay more than 20, 25, or 30,000 naira monthly after graduation, depending on how much you borrowed, depending on the kind of job you're doing, depending on the kind of skills you acquired while schooling. We also anticipate that the student loans will also encourage more students to read professional courses. So rather than the general, social sciences that we're really used to in Nigeria, with student loans, students who probably would have preferred to read medicine, prefer to read engineering, architecture, professional courses that are better employable in Nigeria will be encouraged under the student loan scheme, so that we can have more sciences and more technology-based courses that are more relevant for our modern, for the modern economy, the globalized economy.
The time frame which you have slated for this is not taking into cognizance any strikes that could happen. Because you're actually hoping that a 4-year course to be a 4-year course. but we've seen situations whereby, lecturers have been on strike for close to, for more than a year, or more than half a year. So how do you account for that? Or how do you think that this moratorium period will also account for those periods where there might be in an industrial action by the lecturers?
Well, if there's a national emergency in the country where the entire country comes to a halt and there's no activity, then we'll have to amend and shift as we move along. But we anticipate that through the student loans funding, universities get this funding directly. Issue of strike should be a thing of the past in Nigeria once the government hands off from funding of education directly and makes it more of a private sector kind of thing, and makes it a relationship between the students and the schools themselves. So if as a student, you're paying 1 or 2 million naira to study medicine or study architecture as against paying 200,000 for an entire 4-year course right now, then we expect the schools to also act more responsible in the interest of the students and as much as possible look for other means to address the issue, the grievances that have always been that have always led to these strikes that we've had in the country over the years. So we just hope that Nigeria would come up with a better plan,
we need to. Challenges. After all, our parents tell us those days, we went to scholarship from scratch up until we finished. So there'll be nothing wrong with to make sure this equally happens moving forward. Well, thank you for coming on, Honorable Tessa Ugbo, Chairman, Ad-Hoc Committee on Students' Loan and Access to Higher Education. He's also Deputy Chairman, House Committee on Environment. All right, we do have some messages from you out there. This is a tweet from Dr. Igbanwasa, who himself, right here and right now, is talking about what he describes as the student loan. He says the approach to funding education in Nigeria is commendable. However, this must be matched with improved quality of education and learning environment.
And Festus Akimoyewa says student loans should not be means tested. Every tertiary institution student should be eligible for the loan and it should be paid directly to the school, period.
This one is from Dixon Aka. It's an email. It says, I congratulate the newly sworn-in ministers of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I urge them to settle down quickly and start the needed job to help the president deliver on his mandate. There's more, but I guess we must manage our time.
Well, we most certainly have to. Thank you so much for the privilege of being a part of your morning. We saw your mail as well, Henry Awonono. Thank you so much for it. Also talking about the president's leadership. Well, that's the much of your feedback and the program we can take for this morning. Thank you for the privilege of your morning. I'm Ayo Makinde. Have a wonderful day.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for allowing us to share your morning. I am Bukola Koka.
Thank you. Maokwe Ogun Yusuf.
And I am Chamberlain Osok. Goodbye.